Wonderful. Well, thank you. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alon Friedman, and on behalf of the Coalition for Jewish Values Indiana chapter, of which I am president, I would like to welcome all of you to this special CJV webinar. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Andrew Bostom, our featured speaker. But before I do, I have a few housekeeping comments I'd like to make. Dr. Bostom's lecture will last about 35 minutes, after which the mic will be passed to Mark Hoffman, CJV's Director of Special Projects. Mark will tell us where we can find more of Dr. Bostom's works, as well as provide more information about the Coalition for Jewish Values. We will then have 15 minutes for Q&A. Please submit your questions during or after Dr. Bostom's talk using the chat option. If we don't get to everyone's question, Dr. Bostom has provided his email address so that you can contact him directly after the webinar, and we'll share his email address with you after the Q&A session. We're planning to end this webinar promptly at 3 p.m., but if we run a few minutes over and you need to leave, that's perfectly fine. Before I turn the mic over to Dr. Bostom, I would like to say a few introductory comments that are helpful in explaining his unusual and perhaps even unique skill set and background. Before becoming a renowned authority on Islamic history and theology, the Islamic institution of Jihad war, and Islamic anti-Semitism, Dr. Bostom had a very successful career as a physician scientist and medical epidemiologist. In fact, I first met Dr. Bostom in the year 2000 when he became one of my scientific mentors. It was the attack on the United States on September 11, 2001 that turned his attention to the topic of Islam. Over the following decades, Dr. Bostom has used his exceptional analytic skills that he developed during his years as a scientist to critically evaluate a vast literature of Islamic and Western sources spanning centuries. This led to the publication of 5 well-received books, including in 2005, The Legacy of Jihad, in 2008, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, in 2012, Sharia versus Freedom, and again that year, the Mufti's Islamic Jew Hatred, and in 2014, Iran's Final Solution for Israel. His sixth book, A Modern Quranic Conf Against the Jews, has just been released and forms the basis of our talk today. Very importantly, in these challenging times, Dr. Bostom's work is totally unconstrained by the ideological straitjacket that is familiar to us as PC or woke, thus allowing an honest and dispassionate analysis of the topics he covers. On that note, I would like to thank Dr. Bostom in advance for his presentation today, and now I will turn the mic over to him.
Thank you very much, Alon. Alon and I have known each other, as he mentioned, for over a quarter century now. I also want to thank Rabbi Menken and Ali Luck and Mark Hoffman for providing me the opportunity to present some information about my new book. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully this will go well. Can people see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
I'm going to move to the full screen version. Okay, should be taking up the whole screen pretty much now.
There we are.
Okay, good. So I'm going to make introductory comments. Really, it's an immense book. It was a very unpleasant task for the translator. It's been an equally unpleasant task for me to analyze this massive tome by late Grand Imam Tantawi, and I'm going to share, unfortunately, to a certain extent, that unpleasantness with you. So to orient you, we'll orient you by numbers as an epidemiologist, but this is actually from the Book of Numbers. So Numbers 26:4 really describes the use of biblical polling data, if I may be granted that license, for preparedness to defend ancient Israel. The Lord spoke unto Moses and unto Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saying, take the census, really, of all the congregation of the children of Israel from 20 years old and upward, by their fathers' houses, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. Well, because so much of discussion of anti-Semitism, I find, frankly, very disorienting, I'm going to try and orient you, again, with real data. These are what we could call preparative orientation data. And just to quickly introduce the concept here is that the ADL does one thing very well. They do many things not very well, but what they've done over the past 25 years or so, and they have a history that goes back much further than that, is they've developed, at least in the past 2 decades plus, a very simple instrument for gauging what they appropriately call extreme anti-Semitism. They present the respondent with 11 anti-Semitic stereotypes, and if the respondent agrees with at least 6 out of them, they are classified as an index case of extreme anti-Semitism, and then the ADL just tallies up the commonality of that response and gives a prevalence. And what they've shown in their global surveys, they did one in 2014, and they published one, they released the data just a little under a year ago for using a 2024 survey, massive survey, 103 countries, about 500 individuals were sampled in 90 of the countries, and probably another 1,000 in about 13 of the countries, all collected during 2024. And it just jumps out at you. The striking finding is that the 19 most anti-Semitic countries in the world are all Muslim countries, where the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism ranges from 64 to 97%. And yes, we have a problem in North America and Western Europe with anti-Semitism, but it pales in comparison with the global problem in Muslim societies. And even a country like Indonesia, which I highlighted in red, which for decades had been considered an avatar of more moderate Islam, non-Arab Islam, etc., is now the second most anti-Semitic country in the world after Kuwait and the West Bank, Gaza. And unfortunately, these attitudes travel with Muslims. These are data from Western Europe collected between 2015 and 2023 on the left. And you can see again on the same, using the same survey instrument, this disproportionate prevalence, 2 to 4-fold prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism, comparing Muslims to either Christians as a group or non-Muslims pooled together. And it's translating certainly in Europe, and I'll show you, unfortunately, some similar data from the United States, into physical threats and violence against Jews when Jews are asked who they believed attacked them, and they're given options to identify the attacker. Again, it's disproportionately Muslims who are either threatening them or actually committing violence against them, over 2-fold excess. If we turn to the United States, one other point from this previous slide is that the data on the left-hand side, the ADL data, are no longer available. This is a problem. I don't know. There's no cogent explanation for why they've been removed, but they were out there. We've got screenshots of them, etc. This is even more disturbing to me in one sense. The United States is a much more philo-Semitic country. The prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism is lower than in Western Europe. However, it's a disproportionate Muslim problem. This is a huge survey that the ADL did in 2017, and it involved 3,600 non-Muslims, 800 Muslims, so a big oversample of U.S. Muslims. Over more than 6.3-fold more common. So 38% of the Muslims had extreme anti-Semitism, 6% of the non-Muslims. ADL has never published these data. An investigator actually from Alone's home institution, Dr. Jackelli, published these data in a paper. He got access to the data and published them in 2023, but the ADL itself has never published these data. And I just, for the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism, when I put it out in an updated edition, I reviewed from 9/11, 2001 through the end of December 2019. The book came out in January of 2020. That there were 22 planned Muslim jihadist attacks on U.S. Jews and Jewish institutions. Fortunately, 16 were thwarted, but 6 were completed, and they resulted in 8 deaths and 7 serious injuries during the same time frame. So what do we have from polling data that could actually show a nexus between these kinds of findings and an animating religious ideology? Well, there was a remarkable study done by a Democratic pollster, actually a pollster for the Clintons over many years, Stanley Greenberg. And what he did is he took features from the Hamas covenant, and I'm showing them to you on the left. The Hamas covenant is really a brief document that is peppered with citations from the Quran, some traditions of Muhammad, melded into a document that features both anti-Semitism and jihadism. And this is really punctuated by Article 7 and Article 15. But even the very first statement in the preamble to the Quran is in the preamble to the covenant is a Quranic verse, Quran 3:112, so the third surah, the 112th verse, which talks about the permanent degradation of the Jews because they've committed alleged transgressions against Allah, against the Muslim way of life, including prophet killing, which is updated in the Hadith to poisoning Muhammad himself. Article 7 in the covenant includes a tradition where Muhammad claims the Jews must be destroyed to usher in the Messianic age. Article 15 really is a summons to the entire global Muslim community, or Ummah, to wage a jihad to destroy Israel. So what Greenberg and his investigators did is they actually took language from the covenant and presented it, particularly from these two articles, to over 1,000 Muslims from the West Bank and Gaza in 2011. And 80% agreed with the sentiments in Article 15 that Israel had to be destroyed by a global jihad, and 73% agreed with basically this annihilationist tradition of Muhammad that the Jews needed to be annihilated to the man to bring in the Messianic age. Now, the attention of my book is about a thesis by a late Grand Imam from Al-Azhar University. But just to give you a very brief background of the significance of Al-Azhar, it is really like the Vatican equivalent of Sunni Islam, which represents 90% of Muslims. And its leader, Grand Imams, are the nearest you'll get in Islam. I know Islam is decentralized, etc. We hear that ad nauseum, but it's the closest that you'll get to a papal equivalent. And I give an example of this headline from the Washington Post in 1977, when then Grand Imam Mahmoud visited. And it said, "Leader of World Islam begins a historic tour of America." And in the article, it talks about the man most widely recognized as the spiritual leader of Islam. So to this date, and going back to the Mamluk era, the 13th century in Egypt, the seat of that empire, it's had a tremendous significance as an institution of learning. Unfortunately, we also have this legacy, which dates back to the partition plan in 1947, literally when it was announced, through October 7th itself. And what I'm talking about are a series of formal pronouncements, fatwas, that declare jihad against all the Jews of historical Palestine, even before the state of Israel came into existence. So in 1947, again, upon the partition plan, in 48, at the outset of the Independence War, in January of 1956, 9 months before the Sinai War, at the outset of the Six-Day War in 1967. I'm going to talk about this conference very briefly that was seminal, but there was a whole series of presentations that were organized after the debacle of the 1967 war. And I'll give you a flavor of that at the outset of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and again, even after October 7th. So I want to drill down a little bit on this conference in the aftermath of the 67 war. This was literally a worldwide gathering in Cairo in 1968, in the fall of 1968, and it really marked the end of this guiding ideology of Arab nationalism, at least in terms of the jihad against Israel, the war against Israel, and getting back to formal jihadism and Islamic anti-Semitism, Jew hatred as the guiding rationales. And there was a remarkable summary of this produced by the late historian David Littman, who was a mentor of mine. He produced a pamphlet just taking extracts from the massive publication itself, which was over 900 pages. And it was called something, Arab Theologians on Jews and Israel. And these were the 6 key points from all the presentations at this conference. Jews are frequently denoted as the enemies of Allah. Jews manifest in themselves an historical continuity of evil qualities as described in the Quran. The Jews do not constitute a true people or nation. Israel is the culmination of the historical and cultural depravity of the Jews, and it has to be destroyed by a jihad. The Islam's superiority over all religions is brandished as a guarantee that the Arabs will ultimately triumph. And it is absolutely outrageous for the Jews who traditionally were kept in Arab Islam and humiliated and inferior status. Again, think of that verse that I mentioned, Quran 3:112, and many others, and characterized as cowardly to defeat the Arabs, have their own state, and cause the contraction of the abode of Islam. And so Littman concluded he was very worried. And when he reviewed the proceedings and published his pamphlet, he said that this preaching could lead to the urge to liquidate Israel, politicide or policide, and the Jews to the man as genocide. If the evil of the Jews is immutable and permanent, as suggested at this conference, transcending time and circumstances and impervious to all hopes of reform, there is only one way to cleanse the world of them: by their complete annihilation. So this is the atmosphere in which Tantawi's thesis, the milieu that produced his PhD thesis, which translates as the Children of Israel in the Quran and Traditions. And just very briefly, some milestones in his personal biography. He was born in 1928 in what's called Upper Egypt. He was a Hafiz, so he had a prodigious memory. He memorized the entire Quran at the elementary school age. He attended the Al-Azhar Institute in Alexandria at age 16. He got a master's in education from Al-Azhar's Faculty of Theology in 1958-59. He served in the Egyptian Ministry of Charitable Endowments, or WAC, in the early 1960s. And then in 1966, he produced his thesis, which was published eventually in 1968. He taught at Al-Azhar Faculty of Theology through 1972, and then he was appointed a lecturer at the University of Asyut, becoming a professor and dean in 1976. He became Egypt's national mufti after he'd been elected Al-Azhar Dean of Faculty of Islamic Studies, Islamic and Arabic Studies in late October 1986. He served in that position for 10 years, and during that time, he produced this massive commentary, which he edited, which it translates as the Intermediate or Balanced Interpretation of the Quran. So this is a work on the entire Quran, different than his thesis. And then he served as Al-Azhar Grand Imam for 14 years, from March 1996 until his sudden cardiac death in March of 2010. If you look at something called the 500 most influential Muslims of the world, produced by this mainstream moderate avatar of mainstream moderate Islam out of Jordan, there was an interesting little mini bio of him, which stated that Tantawi's ability to talk about Islam and his scholarly influence are founded on the Islamic practice of tafsir, or Quranic commentary. His current influence is seen in his close participation with the creation of the first online tafsir database, which is a massive database of over 100 Quranic commentaries now, that anyone can access online. It really goes from the classical period right up to modern commentaries, including his own. And there's this dichotomy in Tantawi if you look at images that are promoted by different parties. So on the one hand, Tantawi is liberal or moderate, and that's promoted rather uncritically, frankly, by journalists, diplomats, and academics. But this image, this part of his persona, is abhorred by Muslim traditionalists and the Muslim Brotherhood. And what are some of these aspects? Well, he was very proud of his physician daughter, and that's something to be proud of. In other words, he didn't have any objection to her training and becoming a physician. He opposed the niqab, or face veil, for women. He opposed female genital mutilation, and this is despite its very broad application in Egypt because of the Shafi'ite school of jurisprudence which predominates there. And he openly enjoyed the music of popular Egyptian singers. On the other hand, the Tantawi as illiberal or traditionalist, which is ignored by journalists, diplomats, and academics, but is celebrated by Muslim traditionalists and the Muslim Brotherhood. And these are the unfortunate aspects. He sanctioned the destruction of Israel by a global jihad of the Muslim Ummah, including the use of jihad, terror, homicide bombing, and martyrdom operations against all Israelis. He was openly supportive of the latter as Grand Imam, not just, as you'll see in his thesis. And even after the gruesome Netanya Passover bombing in 2002. And he also supported, at least transiently, bombings against U.S. troops in Iraq. he gave a much broader juridical support you can see this in his Quranic commentaries, you can see it in his PhD thesis, for the imposition of Islamic law worldwide by jihad. You can look at individual verses that are jihad verses, and I've given you some examples of them. And you can look at either particularly at his long Quranic commentary. And he had a very interesting interview back in 2002 with James Reston Jr., which I describe in detail. I'm not going to have time to do it here in the book. And you can see how the journalistic whitewash operates. In other words, Tantawi was allowed to say that, oh, yes, he opposes Al-Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. They don't represent Islam. And yet, of course, out of the ignorance of the journalists, in this case, James Reston Jr., he was not confronted with his own writings on jihad. Again, talking about Jews specifically, he used the Quranic epithet in public on a few occasions. This is Quran 160, the epithet apes and pigs. And he vociferously opposed, even after the peace treaty, and that's the period he's Grand Imam, after 1979, he opposed any sort of normalization with Israel. And this came out in particular when he met with Israel's chief rabbi, Israel Meir Lau. So these are the aspects that the Muslim Brotherhood and the traditionalists admired about Tantawi. And the Muslim Brotherhood even went to the extent of republishing his 1968 thesis during his tenure as Egypt's Mufti. So how can I summarize this massive work for you? I'll give it my best shot. First of all, what we translated was a republication. It's very interesting that we were able to get this version, the 1997 version, again, originally published in 1968. And it included Tantawi's own introduction, or in this case, reintroduction to it. These are his comments. This is while he's Grand Imam about the republication. My main goal for choosing the topic of my dissertation, the children of Israel and the Quran and the Sunnah and the traditions, is to reveal to Muslim youth in particular, and to the rational, reasonable, and fair-minded people in general, the state of the children of Israel, Jews, their history, ethics, lies, depravity, and immorality, relying on what has been mentioned about them in the Holy Quran, the Sunnah, the traditions, and the correct and unequivocal historical facts. And then I'm going to summarize here again. He goes on, really, it's a very compendious, very lucid summary. In chapter 1, these are Tantawi's own words, I talked about the history of the Jews and their conditions ever since they emigrated to Egypt until the second destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans in the year 70 AD. I concluded this chapter by talking about the history of the Jews of Arabia and their social, economic, and religious conditions. In chapter 2, I talked about the method displayed in the Noble Quran to unite the people of the scriptures, Jews and Christians, to Islam. I have also shown its fair, tolerant, and sympathetic approach to them. In chapter 3, I talked in detail about the way the Jews used to conspire against Islam and Muslims to entrap them. I discussed 10 devious and cunning methods they employed to plot against Islam and Muslims. I concluded this chapter by showing the position of the Messenger Muhammad concerning them. As for chapter 4, I talked about the confrontations, meetings of the sword between the Muslims and the Jews, the battle of Banu, these are all Jewish tribes, battle of Banu Kuneka, the battle of Banu Nadir, the battle of Banu Qurayza, and the battle of Khaybar, which was a Jewish oasis. I also talked about the murder of some of the Jewish leaders, such as Ka'b bin al-Ashraf and others. In chapter 5, I detailed the blessings that Allah granted the children of Israel and their position concerning these blessings. I showed how their ingratitude and ungratefulness would lead to bad and undesirable consequences in this world and in the next, so in the hereafter as well. In chapter 6, I talked about the vices of the Jews as depicted in the Noble Quran. I investigated in detail many of the issues on which interpreters have differed, and these differences are really of little consequence certainly to non-Muslims. They're basically minutiae and esoterica. On the major points, they agree. In chapter 7, I talked about their false and deceitful claims as demonstrated in the Noble Quran, and how the Quran responded to their false claims in a way that shuts their mouths, arrests their tongues, and shows their lies and deception. In chapter 8, I mentioned the numerous penalties with which Allah inflicted punishment on the children of Israel for their injustices and immorality in accordance with what has been mentioned in the verses of the Noble Quran. In the conclusion, I talked about Palestine and the Zionist invasion of Palestine at its various stages. I finally showed the most important reasons that led to the catastrophe, the Nakba, that has befallen Palestine, as well as the most important strategies that if we as Muslims follow, will restore Palestine to us. And even more interestingly, he actually gave 5 points of emphasis that he felt required that the reader pay special attention to. One, collect the verses that talk about the children of Israel in the Noble Quran, put them in the most appropriate places, explain and interpret them in an accurate, scientific, and verifiable way. Reference the holy sayings of the Prophet. These are the traditions, the hadith, that are in the same vein as these verses. Alluding to historical facts and current events when interpreting these noble verses, as is clearly seen when I explicate the Almighty's. This is a verse in the Quran, the 7th surah, the 167th verse. He quotes it. In fact, I have mentioned numerous methods for the punishments that have been inflicted on the Jews at various times and ages. I have then explained the reasons why these punishments had been inflicted upon them. And I've put this fourth point in red because I'm going to go into it a little bit. When I explained these verses, I investigated other exegetes, interpreters, and commentators, and chose the most appropriate amongst them, explaining the reasons for my choice. Consider, for example, our interpretation of the Almighty's, and then he quotes Quran 17:4, so from the 17th surah, the 4th verse. We have paid a noticeable, in point 5, we have paid a noticeable attention to Palestine from the historical and political perspectives, as is clearly shown in chapter 1 and in the conclusion. We have conscientiously and faithfully enumerated some methods that would safeguard restoring Palestine to us, to the global Muslim community. So when I had a chance over a year of review to process all this material, what became clear to me is that there's a method to it. These canonical anti-Semitic motifs that Tantawi elaborates at extraordinary length, and I go into a granular discussion of them. These from the commentators, from the traditions of Muhammad, which is the vast preponderance of this thesis, which again is 766 pages in Arabic, and in English translation, our translation is about 625 pages. It's only that they're very briefly interwoven with, and they really form the basis for an authoritative Islamic understanding of these modern, non-Islamic, anti-Semitic sources that he does discuss in the last chapter and a half or so. And those things like the Zoroastrian forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Benjamin Franklin's factitious prophecy about the alleged danger posed to the nascent United States by its absolutely infinitesimal Jewish minority at the founding. There is a tragic comedy sourcing that he has. This is the very last, literally the last words in the book, that this prophecy, which was shown 100 years ago by historians like Charles Beard to be a complete falsehood, Tantawi refers to it as, first of all, he refers to Franklin as the president of the United States, and he refers to it as the Feast of the Constitution from 1789. And he also uses all these Islamic sources as a rationale, even for fulminations that are, really vile, Jew-hating fulminations of Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler. And so the reason that I wanted to rivet on this discussion of Quran 17:4 is that it comes up in what I would call, on the one hand, a reasonable discussion of Tantawi's thesis that was published in 1998 by Dr. Suad Taji Faruqi. But also there's a terrible apologetic in it. So the apt part of her characterization I've quoted here. In a weighty exposition of 700 pages, he lists Quranic verses and hadith, again, traditions, addressing various aspects of his subject. A detailed discussion of these verses and hadiths is offered, incorporating extracts from various commentaries which are cited to substantiate and confirm his understanding of them. While his preference is for the classical commentaries, including, for example, Zamakhshari, and I give you all the dates of death of these classical commentators, Tabari, Razi, Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir. He occasionally refers to the modern commentary Al-Manar by Rashid Rida. Actually, it's also by his mentor Abdu, and they died in the early 20th century. In places, he lists the opinions of several commentators, in turn ending with his own conclusions, and then she goes on to recognize, as might be expected in the case of a study carried out under the supervision of specialists in exegesis, again, interpretation, at Al-Azhar, the style and presentation of Tantawi's work deviates little from traditional Islamic exegetical scholarship. And this is the part that floored me, though. She offers no evidence, and then she makes this categorical statement. She doesn't compare his glosses, his interpretations to the classical commentators that she's appropriately mentioned beforehand. She just goes on to claim, out of the blue, in insisting only on the negative characteristics of the Jews, however, it deviates. His thesis deviates from traditional exegesis. So that became a thrust of my analysis. I went back and said, "Well, I don't really see that. Let me make sure." And so I went back, as Tantawi had stated, he investigated other exegetes and commentators and chose the most appropriate amongst them, explaining the reasons for my choice. And he went on to quote Quran 17:4, and we warn the children of Israel, etc., etc. And he actually did include the comparative Quranic interpretations of these verses, and so I compared them again, going back to also using his mature and complete Quranic commentary, not just his PhD thesis, and there was that statement that this scholar had made, this modern scholar had made, Taji Faruqi, was completely counterfactual. The glosses of both the classical and modern exegetes were very similar. There were some wrinkles to the modern exegetes, which I'll show you. So, but I concluded any objective assessment of all these glosses on Quran 17:4, and really it continues in verse 5, 6, 7, and 8. Mostly it's 4 and 8 that capture the essence. So both classical and modern interpretations reveals they emphasize uniformly indelible pejorative characteristics of Jews, who therefore deserve worldly devastating humiliation and hellfire in the afterlife. And this really debunks Taji Faruqi's unsupported assertion that somehow his interpretations deviated significantly from traditional exegesis. They absolutely did not. And even his very truculent remarks in his thesis, his modern remarks, bringing 17:4 and 8, for argument's sake, up to date regarding modern Jews and their conflict with, quote, the Muslims of Palestine. They're mirrored by the other modern seminal commentators, like Pakistan's former Grand Mufti Shafi in his influential commentary, Mariful Quran. Indeed, his gloss on these verses calls for a global Muslim, purely Islamic jihad to destroy Israel and reimpose Sharia governance on all of Palestine. So it was a very unsupported and misleading statement. Now, um, again, for lack of time, I just want to give you an example. This opens up chapter 6. And this kind of presentation goes on, to be blunt about it, ad nauseum throughout this thesis. But this is a very I think useful summary statement that Tantawi offers. He says, the reader of the Noble Quran will clearly see that it has depicted many of the inappropriate character conducts, despicable manners, and cunning and crooked behaviors that the children of Israel indulged in. It has branded them with disbelief, and this is the pattern. He will give you the Quranic citations that he believes are justifying these statements. It has branded them with disbelief, ingratitude, egotism, cowardice, deceit, rebellion, transgression, cruelty, deviance, hastening to transgression and aggression, unjustly consuming people's wealth, and many more of the vices that are recorded in the Noble Quran. They therefore earned Allah's displeasure, were stripped of Allah's mercy and compassion, and they were stricken with disgrace and misery. Importantly, Quran 261 and 3112. These vices that the Noble Quran recorded can be clearly seen anywhere and throughout the ages. The passage of time has only made these vices more ingrained and rooted in them. I would point out that there are actually Quranic litanies that were published at the 1968 Al-Azhar conference, that the 25 pejorative characteristics of the Jews, again, with Quranic citations. And then there was one updated while Tantawi was Grand Imam by the then head of the Fatwa, Religious Edict Committee, in about 2002, I think it was, that listed 20 such Quranic vices of the Jews. But the stark thing is that When he's commenting as Grand Imam, I don't know if you may recall, there was an Egyptian television dramatization validating the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I think it was called Horseman Without a Horse. And it was broadcast, of course, during Ramadan in 2002. But Tantawi not only tacitly endorsed it, it's the state of denial that permeates the Muslim world, unfortunately. He says, I assume that the series contains criticism of some of the Jews' traits, or that it presents these traits. But this is no reason to make such an official uproar, because there was uproar about the series. The charge of anti-Semitism was invented by the Jews as a means of pressuring the Arabs and Muslims and with the aim of implementing their conspiracies in the Arab and Muslim countries. It should be disregarded. I mean, there is this very in-your-face, profound cognitive dissonance, I find. And so I just want to show you again that if we look at Tantawi's mature Quranic commentary on a key verse in the Quran that really is a timeless declaration of jihad war on Jews and Christians who refuse to submit to Islamic law in, frankly, a rather servile manner. And I've quoted it for you. It's Quran 9:29. Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day and do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful. Do not accept the religion of truth from those who are given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya, the Quranic poll tax, willingly while they are humbled. And there's a whole series that Islamic law evolved of really humiliating rituals for the collection of the poll tax. These are modern Quranic commentaries. Tantawi on the left and Tabatabai, who, by the way, and I pointed out his gloss on Quran 17:4 as being concordant with Tantawi's modern gloss. Tabatabai, just a little excursus here. He was clearly recognized in the academy as the most important modern Shiite Quranic commentator. In fact, there's a major university in Iran, Allama Tabatabai. So Allama is an honorific title of the ultimate theologian, philosopher, or in his case, there was an acronym he was called a theosopher. It's the largest social sciences university in Iran and maybe one of the largest in the Middle East. So he was a towering figure in modern Quranic exegesis commentary from the Shiite perspective. And if you look at the key elements of their modern glosses, so Tantawi from his modern full Quranic commentary and Tabatabai's from his, you feel like you're reading, what people would refer to as a medieval obscurantist. They are validating the classical tradition of exegesis on these verses for the modern times, and in no unequivocal way. And I've highlighted in red on Tantawi, until they pay the jizya willingly and submissively, while they are humbled, humiliated, and subservient to your rule over them. Why? Because those who do not adopt the religion of truth as their religion deserve humiliation and ignominy in this world. As for the afterlife, their torture would be excruciatingly painful and everlasting. They have to be subservient for the Islamic State to function properly. And again, this is the same sentiments you get from a towering Shiite modern Quranic commentator. The verse informs us that the purpose of humiliating them is their submission to an Islamic lifestyle and to righteous religious government within an Islamic society. They shall not be equal to Muslims nor stand out against them as an independent identity free to express anything their souls feel, nor to publicize the doctrines and activities invented by their lunacies that corrupt human societies. So again, you feel like you're reading a medieval obscurantist, but you're reading the ultimate modern Quranic commentators from both the Sunni and Shiite perspective. And I would go even further to say, because I've done this comparison now, that the Hamas Covenant, which was published initially in 1988, is only about maybe a dozen pages, certainly in translation. And Tantawi's PhD thesis from 1968, 20 years earlier, is in our translation is 625 pages. So 10 to 12 pages versus 625 pages. They use Quranic verses identically. I mentioned before that the covenant, the Hamas covenant, opens with Quran 3:112. It's a verse that's featured in Tantawi's The Children of Israel PhD thesis, describing the Jews' rightful permanent humiliation for repeatedly transgressing the will of Allah. The Quran's central conspiratorial Jew-hating motif, as the Jews as spreaders of corruption and discord, is a verse that is punctuated throughout Tantawi's PhD thesis, The Children of Israel, and it's also featured in an article in the Hamas Covenant. And both the Hamas Covenant and Tantawi use this verse to validate, for example, the protocols of the Elders of Zion specifically. In other words, the antecedent to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which of course they both believe is completely true and accurate, it was foretold by the Quran in this particular verse. And also another identical feature of both that I noticed was that Israel needs to be destroyed as a political entity in a real world jihad, which recruits the entire global Muslim ummah community and reimposes Islamic law in the territories. And both the Tantawi and the Hamas Covenant talk about an eschatological war, an end of times jihad war of Jew annihilation, which is required to usher in the Messianic age, and they cite the same traditions, the same canonical hadith from the collections of Bukhari and Muslim. Both do this. But what's going on since Tantawi passed? Was he succeeded by a more enlightened individual as Grand Imam? Unfortunately not. So Ahmad al-Tayeb, who's still the Grand Imam, so he's actually served, his tenure now is longer than Tantawi's. He served since Tantawi passed away suddenly. Tayeb sanctioned homicide bombing against all Israeli Jews in 2007. He claimed in both 2014 and 2018 that when ISIS was ravaging the Middle East, that it was a Zionist plot. He insisted that the Zionist entity Israel was going to march on this sacred stone in Mecca, the Kaaba, and on the Prophet's mosque in Medina, and whatever, capture them. But of course, like his predecessor, he stated in 2018, the issue of anti-Semitism is a lie that continues to deceive nations to this day. Twice also on Egyptian national television, he riveted, on this central anti-Semitic theme in the Quran 582. So the fifth surah, the 82nd verse, which is kind of a psychological projection verse, which says that it's really the Jews harbor the greatest enmity towards the Muslims and therefore have caused all kinds of problems for Muslims. And this is what he said in 2013, but he said the same thing basically in 2017. A verse in the Quran explains the Muslims' relations with the Jews. This is an historical perspective which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer today. He conflates global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jewish and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. This is a cause of great distress for the Muslims. The Quran said it, and then he goes and quotes part of the verse which says, "You shall find the strongest among men in enmity to the believers to be the Jews." I mentioned this earlier in passing about this in this continuum of jihad sanctioning fatwas or religious edicts from Al-Azhar clerics. The day that the carnage was going on October 7th, Al-Azhar issued a statement celebrating it. There's no equivocating. This is what they said as the resistance efforts of the proud Palestinian people. There wasn't an iota of concern or sentiment expressed towards the victims, the predominantly Jewish Israeli victims and others, but nothing about the victims. And then a scant 12 days later or so, a formal fatwa in this long line of fatwas was issued declaring that Zionist settlers, all Israeli Jews, were legitimate targets of jihad. And these kinds of statements were made by other officials, not just other officials from Al-Azhar University, the dean of the Faculty for Islamic and Arabic Studies, on the 17th and 18th of 2023 praised the Hamas attackers and longed for the liquidation of the Jews and their eternal perdition, referring to them again with this Quranic epithet as descendants of apes and pigs, being cursed. This is a reference to Quran 578, being treacherous and murderers of prophets. I've mentioned these verses before, Quran 261 and 3112. The current Inspector General of Al-Azhar's fatwa committees, again, within days, on the day that the attacks were going on, rejoiced over, quote, the demise of descendants of apes and pigs, Quran 560. More recently, going back to Grand Imam Tayyib, again, the current Grand Imam who succeeded Tantawi, on the 77th anniversary of the partition plan, the UN partition plan, of November 29th, 1947, reaffirmed its rejection of this earliest, or one of the early iterations of the two-state solution. When Syria was collapsing into a jihadist morass, of course, it was the fault of the Jews, and they needed to be removed as a cancer. This is a metaphor that we associate more commonly with the Iranian regime, which we hope is going to fall for many years now, as a cancer that must be prevented from spread into the Arab Muslim body limb by limb.
Dr. Bostom, I hate to interrupt, but I want to make sure we have enough time for the Q&A. So maybe
yeah, let me just
take a minute or two to wrap up. And
I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up.
Thanks.
I just wanted to mention that just this past Ramadan, that verse again was repeated, Quran 582. It was very gratuitous. I don't know why there are references to the Quran the references to Ramadan in the Quran. Why they had to go through and highlight this particular verse was again consistent with the Grand Imam, but not consistent with the spirit of Ramadan. And just to conclude, so the consistent polling data demonstrate disproportionate 2 to 4-fold greater extreme Muslim anti-Semitism across the world and in Muslim communities in what would be called the Muslim diaspora in the West. And these data must be shared, they must be recognized, and they have to be discussed without censorship if we're going to have any rational approach to the problem of anti-Semitism. I would say the same thing for this authoritative Al-Azhar inculcation of virulent anti-Semitic themes from Islam's core texts and calling for a global Muslim jihad against Israel. Again, these are not marginal views. These are very authoritative views. Again, widely shared, discussed, and without censorship. And just hope against hope, what we really need to insist upon from Islam's major institutions like Al-Azhar is that they have to begin wrenching reforms of this Jew-hating theology. And we can maybe discuss in the Q&A. We need many Jules Isaacs to come forth and demand such reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bostom. First, I want to make mention that this webinar is sponsored by CJV in Indiana, which is led by Dr. Alon Friedman and Professor Elliot Barkey. If anyone wants more info about CJV Indiana, they should reach out to Dr. Friedman directly at allhoss@yahoo.com. Before we start the Q&A, you can find and buy Dr. Bostom's amazing, groundbreaking new book, A Modern Quranic Kampf Against the Jews. Ali will be putting the links in the chat. By the way, this new book is a book that Natan Sharansky called especially relevant, and Ayan Hersey Ali is quoted as saying readers should be grateful for the sheer rigor of his work. You can find Dr. Bostom on Twitter at Andrew Bostom, and you can read his blog at www.andrewbostom.net. And Rabbi Mencken would like to say a few words right now.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I mean, obviously, this is your opportunity to see some of what Coalition for Jewish Values is working on, bringing you noted scholars. I think everybody would agree that Dr. Bostom's work is, well, I forget what the word was you used, Mark. It wasn't just methodical, it was comprehensive. The page count is in the, I believe in the 800s on this. It is a veritable tome, and there is much to be learned there. As far as Coalition for Jewish Values and what we're doing, it is more necessary than ever. I think people see this robustly in the Jewish world for people willing to talk seriously and forthrightly and bring the truth forward when it is not politically correct, when it is unwoke. That is specifically why Coalition for Jewish Values came about and what we continue to be. This is the only organization that you can rely upon to say to, unfortunately, like there's left-wing clergy wandering around claiming to be rabbis in the Jewish tradition when they only work within a redefinition of their own of what it takes to be a rabbi. They can't manage, for example, to get their way through a page of Talmud. If you don't know the basics of Judaism going back millennia, you don't know how to recognize anti-Semitism. When you do, for the entire Palestine narrative is revealed that this isn't the new anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism always finds a facade to make it palatable, even meritable in the current culture. And that's what's happening today. And that's what Dr. Bostom is talking about. It's been baked into Islam, this idea of a hatred against the Jews. Our voice obviously needs to be much louder, and that's where you come in. In order for us to be able to not only do presentations like this, but have a serious voice in Congress, serious voice in public affairs with the general public, and mobilize people across the country to stand up for traditional Jewish values and to fight against anti-Semitism, we need your help. We need your support. We have been honestly playing a significant role. I think there's been a really serious improvement in the ADL since 2023. But yet, as Dr. Boston pointed out, the data that they produced themselves on Islamic anti-Semitism, they weren't willing to present to the public. Let's get them to admit the truth. Let's get the truth put out there. The resources are there. If we had a budget maybe 1% of their size, we'd have more of a voice. We've already managed to irritate Jonathan Greenblatt. I can tell you that firsthand. But I would appreciate if we had the real opportunity to get him to change further in terms of saying the right thing and just putting the data out there that the hardworking researchers of the ADL have already put together. There's so much to be done better in the Jewish world. There are so many cases where people regret today, Jewish people regret having supported the ADL or HIAS or even the Reform movement, much less the human rights organizations, which sadly, to a very large extent, have been taken over by anti-Semites who are willing to use Israel to obfuscate all the real human rights violations going on around the world. Let's get together and work on changing that narrative. In order to do that, we need your support. I will be putting a link to our donation page in the chat. But Mark, our Director of Special Projects, and myself, as Executive Vice President, we're both anxious to speak to you if you're willing to help us move our efforts forward. Thank you very much. Turning the mic back over to Mark.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I'd just like to remind everybody to sign up for the CJV emails, and you can check our website for any updates. And if you have any interest in telling us what topics you'd like to hear about, please email us and we will consider getting a webinar for those topics as well. I'm going to ask the doctor some questions that we got in the chat. The first question is actually one of my own. In the Quran, Israel is mentioned over 40 times. And as the homeland of the Jews. When did Muhammad start this animosity toward the Jewish people? Because originally they were the people of the book and they actually helped them.
Okay, so it's interesting. So the narrative about the Jews in the Quran, and it is lengthy. It occupies, as Tantawi would say, as other exegetes would say, about a third of it. changes dramatically, and the rejection of Muhammad and the rejection of Islam by the Jewish community is very clear in the Quran. It's not just in the traditions, and the direction of prayer has changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. It's wrong to assume that this is all coming out of the traditions. The Quran itself turns very, very negative against the Jews, and in fact refers to the few Jews who literally convert to Islam as really representing the truth of Judaism. In other words, the whole idea is that Islam is the primordial monotheism, which supersedes both Judaism and Christianity. And you can see this in Quran 367, which says that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, he was a Muslim. And this theme is repeated throughout. So in essence, if there are good qualities about the Jews, and there are few of them according to the Quran, it's Jews who see the light and convert to Islam. And the rest, are again deserve the injunctions of Quran 929, which is that unless they will submit to an Islamic order and suffer the humiliations that entails, war is to be waged upon them. So it's not an attractive picture, and again, it's not just the elaboration in the Hadith. What's elaborated in the Hadith is this tradition of prophet killing that the Jews are accused of, where in the Hadith, and this doesn't occur in the Quran, it's literally Muhammad himself who's poisoned to death by the Jews, and in some of the accounts, it's by a full-fledged Jewish conspiracy. So I would say that the Quran itself paints a very, very pejorative, very dark picture of the Jews, and shows how undeserving they are of the monotheistic tradition.
We're gonna get one more question, and it went so fast it's hard to believe it's 3 o'clock already. I think this is a very interesting question. Medieval Catholic scholarship and clerical works on Jews might have looked similar up until the Reformation and liberalization. Is there any such development in process for Islam currently?
Um, I would I also I would say that the real change in the Catholic Church, and it's true, there were gradual changes that were going in a more positive direction, but the real change in terms of um, teaching to ordinary people really is relatively recent. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary in 2025 of Nostra Aetate Vatican II. Um, my next birthday, I'll be 70. I mean, I saw this occur in my lifetime, and I think it has had an ameliorative effect, but it's really a beginning when you compare those 60 years to the longer traditions. However, there is I agree with you. There were always trends in Christianity that were much more tolerant, indeed, even to a certain extent, revelatory and celebratory of the Jewish tradition. But the real change, certainly within the Catholic Church, is relatively new. I mean, the deicide allegation was being taught, in a very mainstream way up until 60 years ago. I think, with regard to Islam, I think one of the things that could be done, and I would say an organization like CJV is ideally suited to do this, is to be willing to confront whether it's sermons given in local mosques, or much more importantly, religious institutions like Al-Azhar or the Saudis recently at the main Grand Mecca Mosque. There was a very anti-Semitic sermon, which obviously had to be sanctioned by the state. If you were to use, for example, memory as Middle East Media Research Institute as a resource, and just have an algorithm, just have an alert where every sermon that memory captures, particularly from the United States and Canada, there would be a quick review of it, and a rebuke would go out from CJV, and just say, because what would happen is over time You would be doing this. Unfortunately, you have to have a staff person for it. You'd be doing this every week. And it might start, ADL, again, I'm very down on ADL, but once in a while, with its vast resources, ADL will condemn a particularly egregious sermon. But they literally come out every week like clockwork, throughout the year. The weight of that, just, every week, if Rabbi Mencken was on TV every week saying, "Oh, we got another one here," it would start it becomes cumulative. People might start to wake up and say, "Well, this is going on." I discovered in my own community recently. I had never paid any attention to the Islamic Center of Rhode Island in Providence. The same themes. This is also post October 7th, by the way. The same themes that I was pointing out about, Jews as prophet killers were preached at my local mosque. And when I brought it to the attention of the local, alliance, federation type people, crickets, silence, nothing. So I think some of this could take place at the grassroots. Memory is a fantastic resource, but people can listen to mosque sermons on their own. Many of them are in English. But I just think that the barrage of press releases that could go out would start to become cumulative. And I think when you had someone like Deborah Lipstadt, the envoy on anti-Semitism, go to Cairo and celebrate, I don't know, they're doing some historical remodeling of some now abandoned synagogues in Cairo. Well, she could have also used that trip to go to Al-Azhar and confront Al-Tayeb about his virulent anti-Semitism and just say, "Stop this. Stop doing this. You represent the pinnacle of Sunni Islam. Have respect for Jews around the world and stop talking about them this way." I mean, these are the kinds of gestures that I think have to start with. But ultimately, I think as remote as the possibility is right now, something akin to Vatican II has to take place within institutional Islam.